deep structure complexes, as Steve said before, they solve the gap problem. And the gap problem specifically between the ego field broadly, complex field broadly, and the phylogenetic or the ancestral psyche. If there was nothing between those two, nothing would stop an ego going inside and going straight into the ancestral psyche. That would be debilitating. That would be dangerous. That would mean that there's no, forgive me for, I suppose, mechanistic language with this, but there'd be no relay of information to control the information flow between what's personal and individual to somebody, that being the field of the ego, versus the things that we share as a species, the ancestral psyche.
A student in attendance then asks, what is the ancestral psyche? What level of the biopsychosocial stack? Is it meta-instincts?
Meta-instincts and pansepian instincts. We can see this from a biological perspective. We're all humans. We all do human things, and we can't not do human things. But we're all individuals. So everyone's different to each other, but they're also the same at a deep structure level. Being a human. The psychological representation of that innate constitution of the species is the ancestral psyche. So yeah, you can fractionate that down into pansepian instinct and meta-instinct. Then there are equivalents here, or functional equivalents, I suppose. Anthony Stevens spoke on the phylogenetic psyche. And in that sense, he was very interested in the archetypes, Jung's archetypes being present there. And he blended that very nicely with the work of the ethologists and with evolutionary biology. So he changed the word collective unconscious, Jung's term, into phylogenetic psyche, because it's a phylogenetic psyche. Phylogenetic essentially just means evolutionary. Steve and Pauline's is more ramified than that, and there are these two different taxa, meta-instincts and pansepian instincts. And the ancestral psyche is very different. Let's just say in qualia, very broad term, I know, but it's very different to the field of the ego. There has to be something between the two of them, homeostatically mediating the information that moves between them. And if an ego was so inclined and wished to turn inwards and try and contact the ancestral psyche deliberately through, for example, hypnosis, there would need to be a check in place from the non-ego psyche to see if the ego was in a fit enough state to experience the ancestral psyche, to be able to be updated. Because you can imagine an ego would need to have significant strength, ego strength, be homeostatic and adapted enough to the outside world before it's going to be allowed access in that kind of way, directed inner work to the ancestral psyche. If not, the ego could experience something that completely throws it over and it loses its external reality adaptation straight away. Go psychotic in extreme cases. So there has to be something mediating that. That structure is the deep structure complex, or deep structure complexes existing as a field. And there's a gradient to its function. So the one that you have seen Steve and Pauline in the past emphasize the most is its function of reflecting back to the ego's adaptation from the perspective of the non-ego psyche. That's really important because that is the immediate response that the unconscious, so-called the non-ego psyche, has to internal projection. And internal projection is rife today. In our era of the internet, Steve's pointed this out before, I think we said it in a seminar recently, the internet allows for essentially an infinite amount of suggestive stuff, models of stuff, to saturate the ego, inform its understanding of itself, and then the ego will just project that inwards. So if the ego is doing that, internally projecting, expecting to find whatever in the non-ego psyche, classical ones obviously are Jung's model of the psyche, or even Freud's model of the psyche, or more philosophical models of the psyche, whatever it is. If someone looks inside and expects to find their shadow because they've been told it's going to be there, they're going to meet with their shadow. Not a real shadow, but that mirrored back to them, because that keeps the ego occupied with itself in a fantasy holding space to protect it from going any further. Because an ego that's doing that is not in a fit enough state, reflexive state, adaptive state to adapt to the outside world. So that function has to be there. That's the first thing that a deep structure complex will do. If the ego isn't doing that so much, or if the ego has greater ego strength, they're a step on from just internally projecting stuff over the psyche, then a deep structure complex will take on more of a psychopomp role. The psychopomp role then is, its purpose is to then lead progressively, but lead the ego into a greater understanding of itself in relationship to the non-ego psyche, to help it move into a fit enough state so that it can then receive, as you said, the meta instincts from the ancestral psyche. So it has to be progressive. So that's that in a very quick sense, that's what deep structure complexes evolved for. They're homeostatic mediators that will protect the ego by keeping it out from the ancestral psyche, or can help psychopomp lead the ego towards a state where it can receive meta instincts and update itself deliberately from the inside. Steve and Pauline have emphasized that there are different ways of accessing meta instincts. That way is so going inside, for example, with hypnosis is one way of doing it. That's to try and deliberately access. But they can also emerge spontaneously too. So it's not as if the ego has to deliberately work with deep structure complexes if they're going to access the ancestral psyche. That's not true. It's only for an ego who is concerned with going inside and accessing those things for itself, as traditions and cultures have tried to do forever since the dawn of time under different names. So you asked for an example. An example that Steve has given several times before are these wrathful deities within Tantric Buddhism. And I'm hesitant to want to explain that because I have no direct experience of Tantrism. But essentially, if I can do the best job that I can, the Tantric tradition teaches the practitioner that when they encounter these so-called wrathful deities on the inside, they're not real and they have created them. So they're representations of themselves that can be worked with to transmute the energy that's within them to what's then behind them. So deep structure complexes exist in that form within Tantra, but you see them constantly in more or less any myth that you come across. Any guardian of a gate, a character that will take somebody across a river, that kind of thing. Someone who asks a riddle of, say, the protagonist, and the protagonist has to answer in the right way. They'd be examples of deep structure complexes, because they move the ego from one place to another, which is synonymous in narrative representational form with a greater updating of consciousness of oneself, who they are, who they're not, too. So that's updating the self-image, perhaps, broadly, and that in relation to the non-ego psyche.